At 6:58 in the morning, a federal phone rang inside Harlow General Hospital, and the man who answered it went pale before the second sentence was finished. 12 hours earlier, he had signed the termination papers himself. He had shaken the woman's hand, watched her pack a cardboard box, and told his assistant it was finally done. Now a voice from Washington was telling him to get her back by noon, or the hospital would lose its federal authorization entirely. The nurse he had fired, the one he called difficult, unstable, a problem had once pulled a wounded senator out of enemy fire and kept him breathing with nothing but her hands and whatever she could find in the dark. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been on this channel before, hit that subscribe button right now, because we post stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. If this one already has you locked in, drop a like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, anything. We genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. The morning Evelyn Marsh was fired, the sky over Dunmore, Pennsylvania was the color of old concrete flat, heavy, the kind of gray that made even the hospital parking lot look like a place where things came to stop rather than start. She had worked the overnight shift, 12 hours in the ICU, same as she had done 3 or 4 nights a week for the past 9 years at Harlow General. She was 34 years old, and she moved through the ward with the kind of quiet efficiency that came not from training manuals but from years of learning what it felt like when something was about to go wrong before any monitor could tell you. She clocked out at 7:15. She was halfway to the elevator when Helen Briggs, the floor supervisor, caught up with her and said that Director Callum Steer wanted to see her before she left. Evelyn didn't turn around immediately. She stood still for a second, hand resting on the strap of her bag, then took a breath and walked back down the hall. Callum Steer's office was on the 3rd floor, corner window, the kind of room that had been designed to communicate authority. He was 51, trim in a way that suggested personal investment in appearances, and he had a habit of folding his hands on the desk when he was about to say something he had already decided before you walked in. His hands were folded when she entered. Sitting beside him was Renata Kuhl from Human Resources, a woman Evelyn had spoken to exactly twice before, once during onboarding, once when a staffing complaint she'd filed had been quietly reassigned to a different department and then apparently lost. "Evelyn," Callum said, "close the door, please." She closed it. "We've been going through your personnel file," he started, "and the pattern of complaints filed against you, as well as complaints you filed, and we feel, the leadership team and I, that the working relationship has deteriorated to a point that isn't productive for anyone." She looked at him steadily. "What does that mean, specifically?" Renata opened a folder. "There have been 4 formal complaints submitted by attending physicians over the past 18 months. Concerns about your conduct during rounds, your communication style with senior staff." "Dr. Gentry filed 2 of those," Evelyn said. "Both within a week of me reporting his discharge of a patient who'd been running a temperature for 22 hours. And Dr. Ashford filed his after I questioned his post-operative pain management protocol for a woman who was showing early indicators of respiratory suppression." Callum leaned back slightly. "Evelyn." She was transferred to intensive care 6 hours later. Her oxygen saturation had dropped to 88%. "We're not here to relitigate individual cases." "Then what are we here to do?" A short silence, not uncomfortable for her, uncomfortable for them. "We're here to inform you," Renata said carefully, "that your employment with Harlow General is being terminated, effective immediately, on the basis of repeated insubordination and conduct detrimental to the collaborative working environment." Evelyn didn't move. She looked at Renata, then at Callum, then back at the folder in Renata's hands, as though she could read what was written inside it through the cardboard. "The safety reports I filed," she said. "The staffing concerns. The medication discrepancy log from March, those are all in that file?" "The file reflects the full record," Renata said. "Then you know I flagged a 2-week period where night shift TCU coverage was running 1 nurse short of the state-mandated minimum." "Do you want to tell me how that's insubordination?" Callum said. "You went around department leadership and submitted that report directly to the board." "I submitted it to department leadership 3 times first. I have the emails, Evelyn." His voice had dropped, quiet and final, the tone of a man closing a door. "This decision has been made. We'd like to offer you a standard severance package and a neutral employment reference." "Keep the reference," she said. She stood up, and her chair made a small scraping sound against the floor. "You're making a mistake," she said. Not angry, not emotional, simply factual, the way she might tell a physician that a patient's numbers didn't add up. Not because of me. Because of what happens the next time someone notices something that doesn't look right and decides it's not worth the trouble. Callum held her gaze. He was not going to change his mind. Could see that clearly. "I'll collect my things," she said. She had one coffee mug, a photograph of her father, taken in front of a desert staging area, and a small patch Army Medical Corps, faded from years of sitting in sunlight on her locker shelf. Put them in a cardboard box. She did not say goodbye to the floor. She didn't want people trying to fix their faces into expressions of sympathy. She did stop at the doorway of room 11 for a moment, where a 67-year-old man named Bernard was recovering from aortic valve surgery. She had been watching him for 2 nights, quietly flagging a slight unevenness in his breath sounds that she suspected the day shift team was not going to catch. She looked at him sleeping and made a decision she would think about later. She went to the nursing station, pulled up his chart, added a detailed note about her observations, and flagged it for follow-up. It was not her patient anymore. It was not arguably her place. She did it anyway. Then she walked to the elevator, took it to the ground floor, and went home. The apartment was quiet in the way that Dunmore mornings were quiet, not peaceful, just empty. She put the cardboard box on the kitchen table, made coffee, and sat down in front of her laptop. She opened a blank document and began updating her resume. She typed her name, Evelyn Marsh. She typed the degrees, the certifications, the years. She paused when she got to the line for military service and sat looking at it for a long moment. U.S. Army, 2009-2016. Medical Corps, Special Operations Support. She stared at it. Then she typed the word classified next to several of the deployment entries and moved on. Most people who saw her resume never asked about those years. The ones who did ask usually accepted a brief, vague answer about overseas service. She had never explained what the service actually involved, partly because most of it couldn't be explained in a job application, and partly because the woman who had done those things felt like someone she had known a long time ago, someone she was connected to, but no longer fully inhabited. She was on her 3rd paragraph of the resume summary when her phone rang. Unknown number. Pennsylvania area code, but not one she recognized. She let it ring. It stopped. 10 seconds later it rang again. She answered. Evelyn Marsh. It wasn't a question. Coffee down. This is Agent Dennis Farrow. I'm calling on behalf of the Office of Presidential Security. Is this a secure line? She almost laughed. Not a mean laugh, just the involuntary reaction to a phrase she hadn't heard in almost 8 years. She pushed it down. It's a cell phone, she said. Make of that what you will. I understand. I'll be brief. Your name has come up in connection with a federally coordinated medical event taking place in your area within the next 48 hours. I'm not able to give you full details over this channel, but you'll be contacted shortly by someone whose voice you may recognize. I need to confirm you received this call. You've confirmed it, she said. He hung up. Evelyn sat very still for a moment, then looked at the coffee mug on the table, the one with the chip on the handle. The one she'd carried into Callum Steer's office building on her first day and carried back out in a cardboard box 6 hours ago. She thought about Bernard in room 11. She thought about the note she'd left in his chart. She thought about the look on Callum Steer's face when he'd said the decision had been made. Then her phone rang again. She recognized the voice immediately, not because it was famous, though it was, but because she had last heard it in a very different context. Lower, strained. Asking her if she could keep pressure on the wound while he stayed conscious long enough to give her the coordinates they needed to radio in. She had said yes. She had kept the pressure. They had both survived. Evelyn. President Raymond Vos' voices was measured. The same careful steadiness she remembered from the field. 7 years had given it more formality. The core was the same. Mr. President, she said. A small pause. I heard you had a difficult morning. News travels. Faster than it should sometimes. Another pause. I won't keep you long. I know how you feel about favors. I don't mind favors, she said. I mind being managed. Fair point. She could hear something shift in the background movement. A door closing. The ambient drop of a secure space. I'm scheduled for a cardiac procedure at Harlow General in 36 hours. My medical team has reviewed the approved staff roster twice. Your name is on both reviews. I was terminated this morning. I'm aware. So you need someone else. My team doesn't want someone else. The cardiologist who will perform my procedure knows your clinical record. He specifically requested your presence for the ICU phase. So did I. She looked at the photograph on the table. Her father, squinting against the sun, standing in front of a Humvee, with his arm around a younger version of herself who was already wearing a uniform and didn't yet know what it meant. I appreciate the call, she said, but I won't come back just because you're asking. If I walk back into that building, it needs to mean something that lasts longer than your procedure. Silence. Then what do you need? Immediate reinstatement, not provisional. An independent investigation into the conduct that led to my termination, not run by the hospital, not run by their legal team. Formal policy protection for nurses who file patient safety complaints. And a full audit of every disciplinary action in that department over the past 3 years. Another silence, longer this time. You've thought about this. I've had a full morning, she said. Done, he said. All of it. I'll have Pharaoh coordinate with the hospital board directly. You'll have the written commitment before noon. Evelyn looked at the open resume on her laptop. The cursor was still blinking in the middle of a sentence she'd stopped writing. I'll be there by 2 o'clock, she said. What she didn't know when she hung up, what none of them knew yet, was that room 11 had been flagged for urgent review by the day shift team at 8:45 that morning. Bernard's breathing had worsened. The nurse who picked up Evelyn's chart note had initially dismissed it as the departing employee commentary of someone with a grudge. But the attending physician, a second-year resident named Dr. Sophie Kwan, who had worked alongside Evelyn twice before and trusted her read, had ordered a chest assessment. The X-ray came back at 9:15, a developing pneumothorax, small but progressing, and already below the threshold that would have triggered the standard monitor alarm. Had the note not been in the chart, it would have been another 4 or 5 hours before anyone looked closely enough to catch it. By then, Bernard might not have been recoverable. Dr. Kwan stood in the hallway, outside room 11, after the attending team had begun treatment, holding the chart and reading Evelyn's note for the second time. She looked at the timestamp on it. Evelyn had written it 8 minutes before her key card was deactivated. 8 minutes before she was officially no longer employed at Harlow General. Kwan folded the chart, turned to the resident standing beside her, and said quietly, "Find out where Evelyn Marsh went." By the time Evelyn's car turned into the Harlow General parking structure at 1:47 p.m., 2 things were happening simultaneously inside the building that she didn't know about yet. First was that Callum Steer had received a phone call from the hospital's board chair at 11 that morning, followed by a visit from 2 individuals in suits who did not work for the hospital and who declined to specify which agency they did work for. Callum had been in his office since that visit with the door shut, and his assistant fielding every call. The second was that Harlow General's federal authorization was under preliminary administrative review. Status triggered automatically whenever a covered federal medical event intersected with a contested personnel action involving a security-cleared individual. Evelyn had not known she was still in a security file. She had not known she had ever been in one. She found out when Pharaoh met her at the parking structure entrance, showed her a card, and said, "There's something we need to tell you before you sit inside." She looked at the card. Federal lettering. She'd seen the format before. "How long?" she asked. "Since 2017, he said. The clearance was maintained when you transitioned to civilian practice. Standard protocol for certain categories of service personnel. You were never flagged for removal." She stared at him for a moment. Callum Steer fired a federally cleared asset without notifying anyone. "He didn't know," Pharaoh said. "That information isn't accessible at the hospital level, but that's exactly the problem." She thought about that, about the paperwork, the folder in Renata Kuhl's hands, the phrase "conduct detrimental to the collaborative working environment." "He had no idea," she said slowly. "None." She almost felt something like sympathy for Callum Steer. Then she thought about Bernard's chart note and the 3 safety reports that had been quietly lost, and the ICCCU nights with 1 fewer nurse than the law required. The sympathy went back wherever it had come from. She took a breath, picked up her bag, and walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open. The lobby went quiet. 3 nurses near the reception desk looked up. A pair of orderlies stopped mid-conversation. A physician Evelyn, recognized from the 4th-floor step-down unit, stared at her from across the atrium. Evelyn didn't slow down. She walked through the lobby, took the elevator to the second floor, and went directly to the ICU. It was Jonah Reeves who saw her first, a charge nurse with 10 years on the floor, someone who had watched Evelyn get reprimanded twice at staff meetings and had said nothing both times because he had a mortgage and a daughter in middle school. And he knew how these things went. He was standing at the medication cart when she came through the double doors. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Marsh," he said. "Reeves." She looked around the unit, the board, the monitors, the positioning of the staff. "Where's the patient in Bay 6? I flagged her chart 3 days ago for irregular chest expansion." Jonah didn't ask how she knew about the patient. He didn't ask why she was here. He grabbed the chart and handed it to her. She read it standing up, moving through the room slowly, and the monitors beep their steady rhythms around her, and the unit absorbed her the way a familiar space absorbs a person who belongs in it, without fanfare, without ceremony, the way water returns to level. She was home, even if home had tried to throw her out. And somewhere 2 floors above her, in a corner office with a shut door, Callum Steer was on the phone with the board chair for the second time in 4 hours, listening to a list of things he had not known and would now have to answer for. The morning he had signed those termination papers, he had believed he was solving a problem. By late afternoon, he was beginning to understand he had created one, and that it was standing in his ICU right now, reading a patient chart, and the people sent from Washington were there to make sure she stayed. Callum Steer didn't come down to the ICU that afternoon. He sent Helen Briggs instead. Helen was the floor supervisor who had intercepted Evelyn that morning and walked her up to the termination meeting, a fact that neither of them acknowledged when Helen appeared at the ICU entrance at 2:43, holding a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had been handed a task she did not want and could not refuse. Evelyn was at the central station, reviewing the medication log for the past 24 hours. She looked up when Helen came through the doors, held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the screen. "Evelyn," Helen said, "I need to let you know that your reinstatement is still being processed, technically, until the paperwork is finalized through HR." "Agent Farrow emailed the board chair at 11:17 this morning," Evelyn said, not looking up. "The board chair countersigned the reinstatement authorization at 1:52. I have the document on my phone. Would you like to see it?" Helen's mouth opened slightly, then closed. "I'll check with Renata," she said. "You do that," Evelyn said. Helen left. Jonah Reeves, who had been pretending to update a chart 3 feet away during the entire exchange, waited until the double doors had swung shut, then said quietly, "She's going to go straight to Steer." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's going to make the next few hours interesting." The next few hours were already going to be interesting. She pulled up a different screen. "Who's covering Bay 4 tonight?" The patient in there had a potassium level at 3.1 this morning, and nobody ordered a follow-up panel. Jonah looked. "That would be Delgado." She picked up a double. "Tell her when she comes back from break, and the potassium needs to be addressed before 6, or we're going to be dealing with an arrhythmia at midnight." "Got it." She moved on to the next chart. The unit resumed its rhythm around her. Not comfortable exactly, but functional, the way a dislocated joint feels after it's been reset. Still sore. Still wrong in a way you could feel, but back in the socket, doing what it was supposed to do. What Evelyn had not told Jonah, or Helen, or anyone in the building, was that she had spent 30 minutes in the parking structure before coming inside. Farrow had briefed her on the basics of the presidential visit, the timeline, the security parameters, the fact that President Voss's cardiologist, a man named Dr. Marcus Ellery, who she had never met, had specifically requested her involvement in the post-procedural ICU phase. She'd listened, asked 3 questions, gotten answers to 2 of them, and then stood in the concrete structure for a moment before going in, not because she was nervous, but because she needed to locate something inside herself. She had promised Voss she would return for the patients. She had meant it. But meaning something and doing it were different things when the building you were walking back into was the same one that had tried to use her own professional record against her 6 hours earlier. The same files, the same offices, the same administrative structure that had decided she was more problem than asset. She had stood there and thought about what it felt like, at 26 years old, to be pinned behind a crumbled wall with no communications equipment, 1 tourniquet, and a man bleeding from a wound in his upper left side who was going to die if she didn't figure out that the next 3 things very fast. She had not thought about consequences then. She had thought about the problem. She decided she would do the same thing now. The problem was the patients. Everything else was secondary. She went inside. By 4 in the afternoon, she had reviewed every active chart in the ICU, flagged 2 patients for additional assessments that had not been ordered, corrected a dosage calculation on a post-surgical patient's anticoagulant that had been entered incorrectly during the shift transition, and quietly asked Jonah to pull the staffing log for the previous 2 weeks. She had not announced any of this. She had not gathered staff for a speech. She had simply moved through the unit and done the work, and the work had the effect it always had. People started paying attention. A second-year nurse named Priya Suri had initially watched Evelyn with the careful wariness of someone who had heard rumors and was unsure which version to believe. By 3:30, Priya was the one who came to Evelyn with a question about a patient's respiratory rate, and Evelyn had answered it directly and without condescension, and had then asked Priya what her instinct was before telling her to act on it. Priya had looked slightly startled by that. Like being asked for her opinion was not something she was accustomed to. Evelyn had noticed that without saying anything about it. At 4:15, she stepped out of the unit to call her sister, who had been texting her since noon with increasing frequency, after someone she knew at Harlow General had apparently mentioned seeing Evelyn in the lobby. Call lasted 4 minutes. Her sister asked 3 times if she was okay, and Evelyn said yes each time, which was mostly true in the ways that mattered and partially not true in the ways she didn't have time to explain. She was back in the unit at 4:20. She did not see Callum Steer coming until he was already through the doors. He had not sent anyone this time. He came himself, which meant the situation had escalated to a point where delegation felt like weakness. He was wearing his coat still, as though he'd come directly from somewhere else, and he had 2 people with him, not security, not HR. One of them Evelyn recognized as the hospital's legal counsel, a man named Preston Hale, who had been at Harlow General for years, and who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent his career arriving slightly too late to prevent things. Callum stopped at the nursing station. Evelyn looked up. "We should talk in private," he said. "We can talk here," she said. "I'm not leaving the floor." Callum glanced at Jonah, at Priya, at the charge nurse from the afternoon shift who had just come on and was standing near the medication cart, pretending not to listen. "This isn't appropriate for—" "You fired me in your office this morning," Evelyn said. "Think we're past worrying about appropriate settings." Preston Hale put a hand on Callum's arm. A brief touch, a signal. Callum exhaled. "The board has indicated that a reinstatement authorization was issued," he said carefully. "We're reviewing the process by which that occurred." "Process by which that occurred is that a federal agency contacted your board chair and explained the situation," Evelyn said. "Is there a part of that you'd like clarified?" "What situation?" Callum said. "Specifically." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not triumphant. Just measuring how much he actually didn't know versus how much he was pretending not to know. His confusion was real. She could see that. He genuinely had not known, when he signed termination papers, that she carried a federal security clearance that had been maintained since her discharge. He had known nothing about her service, beyond what appeared on her standard personnel record, which listed military experience in broad and unspecific terms. He had looked at her file and seen a nurse with a pattern of complaints and a habit of escalating disputes past the people she was supposed to report to. He had not known what the military section of that file actually meant. Didn't make what he did forgivable, but it made it comprehensible. And Evelyn had learned, over years of working in environments where people made bad calls under pressure, that comprehensible and forgivable were not the same category. "A federal medical event is taking place at this hospital in approximately 30 hours, she said. "My name was on the approved clinical roster for that event. You terminated me without running the standard clearance check that would have flagged the conflict. That's the situation." Callum stared at her. Preston Hale was writing something on a small notepad. "Who else knows about this event?" Callum asked. "The people who need to," she said, "which, until this morning, did not include you at this level of detail. That's also part of the situation." The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone. Callum stood there with the expression of a man rearranging a large number of things he thought he understood into a new and deeply unwelcome configuration. "I need to make some calls," he said finally. "That seems wise," Evelyn said, and turned back to the chart she had been reviewing. He left without another word. Preston Hale lingered for exactly 3 seconds longer, looking at Evelyn with the evaluating expression of a man cataloging potential liability, then followed Callum out. Jonah waited until the doors closed, then let out a slow breath. "How are you not shaking right now?" he asked. "I am shaking," Evelyn said. "I'm just good at it." She turned the chart page. The potassium level in Bay 4 still hadn't been addressed. She picked up the phone to find Delgado. The next 12 hours were the particular kind of difficult that didn't look like anything from the outside. Evelyn worked. The unit demanded things, and she gave the things it demanded. And there was a specific exhaustion that came with returning to a place that had rejected you and being the most functional person in the room anyway. It was an exhaustion she recognized from field rotations, the kind that lived in the back of your jaw and behind your eyes, that you managed by moving through it rather than stopping to acknowledge it. She got second dosage error at 6:30. This one on the overnight patient board, a labeling discrepancy that had been created during the afternoon shift change. She corrected it, documented it, and flagged it for the incoming charge nurse without making it a confrontation. The incoming charge nurse was a woman named Dara Hollis, who had been at Harlow General for 14 years and who had the protective stillness of someone who had learned not to step into other people's fires. She had watched Evelyn's termination that morning, done nothing, she would be the first to say it, and was now watching Evelyn's return with a combination of relief and guilt that she was managing by being extremely precise about everything she said. "Dosage flag in Bay 2, Evelyn told her. "Labeling error from shift change. Corrected it and documented, but you'll want to note it in your handoff." "I see it," Dara said. "Thank you." A pause. "For what it's worth," Dara started. "It doesn't need to be said," Evelyn told her, not unkindly. Didn't. Not because she didn't care, but because the time for that conversation wasn't now, in the middle of a floor handoff, and she knew that if she let Dara finish the sentence, she would have to manage Dara's feelings about it, as well as her own, and she only had capacity for one of those things tonight. Dara nodded. They moved on. At 8:15 that evening, Dr. Marcus Ellery arrived on the floor. He was the president's cardiologist, though he arrived wearing a standard attending badge and made no announcement about why he was there. He was 62, with close-cropped gray hair, and the compact authority of someone who had spent 40 years being the most important person in a room without needing to perform it. He found Evelyn in the medication room and said, without preamble, "You're Marsh." "I am," she said. "I've read your clinical notes from the past 2 years." He paused. "All of them. The flagged ones, the filed ones, the ones that went into disciplinary review." She looked at him. And I want to know why you flagged the ejection fraction estimate on the Garrison case in February." Tending had signed off. She told him. It took about 90 seconds. He listened without interrupting, asked one technical follow-up question, listened to the answer, and then nodded once. "Right," he said. "Did I get it right?" she asked. The patient was transferred to a cardiac center 4 days later. When the attending's estimate proved optimistic, he said, "You got it right." He looked at her for a moment. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day," he said. "Most of them are," she said. "I'll need you in post-procedural monitoring from the moment he's out of the OR. Nothing gets flagged. Nothing gets filtered. You see something. You tell me directly. Not the charge nurse, not the attending on duty. Me. I'll need to know every medication he was administered in the 48 hours before the procedure," she said. "Full list, not the summary. You'll have it by 6 a.m. and I want a direct line to you, not through a coordinator." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a card with a number handwritten on the back. "Anything else?" he asked, she thought. "The recovery room adjacent to the ICU. Who authorized its current configuration?" He frowned slightly. "Facilities management." "Why?" "The monitoring station is positioned so that the overnight nurse has to physically move to see 2 of the 4 beds. In a standard recovery scenario, that's a minor inefficiency. In a high-security post-procedural scenario, it's a setup for a gap." Ellery was quiet for a moment. "I'll have facilities reconfigure it tonight." "Tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow morning." "Tonight," he confirmed. He left. Evelyn looked at the card in her hand, then slid it into her scrub pocket. She was tired. Her feet hurt. She had been awake for nearly 36 hours counting the overnight shift she'd worked before the termination meeting. She had not eaten a full meal since the previous afternoon. She went to the break room, found a slightly stale granola bar in the cabinet she had stocked herself 2 weeks ago, sat down in a plastic chair, and ate it in 4 bites while staring at the wall. The wall did not offer anything useful. She threw the wrapper away and went back to the floor. The federal security team arrived at 9 p.m. in 2 waves. The first wave was 6 agents who did a physical sweep of the ICU and adjacent corridors, quiet, efficient, minimally disruptive. Most of the staff didn't fully register what they were seeing until the agents were already done and stationed at intervals in the hallway. The second wave was Pharaoh, who came to the nursing station to review the staffing roster with Evelyn and confirm which personnel would have access to the post-procedural recovery area. This was where things became complicated. 3 nurses on the overnight roster had not been cleared at the required federal level. This was not unusual. The level of clearance required for a presidential medical event was not most hospital staff would have or would ever need. But it meant that Harlow General's overnight ICU coverage, which was already running lean by 2, was now effectively running lean by 5. Evelyn stood at the scheduling board and looked at the math. "We're 3 short for the overnight," she said. "The hospital has been notified," Pharaoh said. "They're supposed to be arranging coverage." "Who did you notify?" "Director Steer's office." Evelyn looked at the board. Callum Steer's office had been quiet since 7. No communication had come to the floor about coverage arrangements. She looked at Pharaoh. "Does the word 'supposed' concern you at all?" Pressed his lips together. "I'll follow up. I'll call the per diem coordinator myself," she said. "It'll be faster." She did. The coordinator, a woman named Becky, who was used to receiving late calls and had learned not to ask too many questions, confirmed that no emergency coverage request had been filed through the hospital system as of 8:50 p.m. Evelyn asked for 2 cleared nurses from the pool and explained briefly the nature of the clearance requirement. Becky said she had 3 names on file with prior federal facility credentials and would start calling. By 10:15, 2 of the 3 had confirmed. The third was unreachable. Evelyn did the math again. They would be 1 short. Not critically, not the way an open-heart floor would be 1 short, but enough that any unexpected situation would immediately create a gap. She didn't sleep that night. She told herself it was because she was on call. It was partly that. It was also that she kept thinking about Bernard in room 11, whose chart note she had written 8 minutes before her key card was deactivated, and who had been pulled back from a developing pneumothorax because a resident she'd worked with twice had trusted her instinct. 8 minutes. How many times in that building had something been 8 minutes from going the other way? How many reports had gone into files and stayed there? She walked the floor at 2 a.m. As the hospital settled into its overnight quiet, the monitors steady, the hallways dim, the nursing staff moving in the careful and slightly exhausted patterns of people in their second half of a long shift. She passed the temporary recovery room that had been reconfigured by facilities at 10:30, the monitoring station repositioned, sightlines cleared. She checked the configuration against the layout Ellery had approved and made 1 additional adjustment to the angle of a peripheral monitor. She stood in that room for a moment. Tomorrow afternoon, the President of the United States would come out of a cardiac procedure in an OR 2 floors above her, and he would be brought down here, and the next several hours would either be routine or they would not be. She had been in enough situations to know that you could not fully prepare for the ones that were not routine. You could only prepare yourself. She was doing that. She was also doing something she would not have fully admitted to, which was making sure, completely and personally sure, not trusting it to anyone else, that this room and this floor were as safe as she could make them. Not because the president had called her. Not because of what had happened between them 17 years ago in the dark, and the noise, and the smell of burning fuel and sand. Because it was her floor. Even when they had tried to take it from her, it had been her floor. Still was. By 6:15 the next morning, 3 things were already going wrong. The first was manageable. One of the overnight per diem nurses, a woman named Tasha, who had come in on short notice, had a family emergency at 4 a.m. and had to leave at shift's end rather than staying for a 2-hour overlap that Evelyn had quietly been counting on. Created a transition gap that she spent 40 minutes restructuring. The second was less manageable. Dr. Owen Gentry, the same physician who had filed 2 of the complaints against Evelyn, and whose premature discharge of a febrile patient she had formally reported 15 months earlier, arrived on the floor at 6:30 for his regular morning rounds and stopped cold when he saw her at the nursing station. He was a tall man, 55, with the kind of rigid posture that in a military context would read as discipline, and in a hospital context read as someone who had been told he was important for long enough that his spine had started to believe it. He looked at Evelyn for a full 3 seconds without saying anything. Then, "What are you doing here?" Not a question. A challenge wearing the shape of a question. "Morning rounds," she said. "Bay 7 needs a reassessment. The overnight pain management regimen isn't controlling adequately. You were terminated yesterday. I was reinstated yesterday afternoon." She kept her voice even. Paperwork cleared through HR at 4:58 p. M. You can verify with Renata Cool. Gentry's jaw tightened. He looked around the unit at Jonah, who had just come back for a second consecutive shift. At Priya, who was watching from across the room with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that certain confrontations required witnesses. "This isn't over," Gentry said quietly enough that only Evelyn heard it. "It's not." He walked past her toward his patient rooms. She turned back to the chart she'd been reviewing. The third problem was the one that changed everything. 7:48 a.m. Evelyn's phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was Washington. She stepped into the supply corridor and answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman she did not know, who identified herself as the Deputy Director of the Office of Presidential Medical Operations, a position whose existence Evelyn was aware of in the same abstract way. She was aware of most federal administrative structures, vaguely and without expectation of ever interacting with it. "Miss Marsh," the woman said, "I'm calling because an issue has been flagged in the preliminary security assessment of Harlow General that I need to discuss with you directly." "Go ahead," Evelyn said. The assessment identified a pattern of internal safety reporting discrepancies that are significant enough to potentially affect the medical authorization status of the facility. Specifically, there are 18 months of flagged reports filed by nursing staff, including yourself, that were documented internally but not forwarded through the required external reporting channels. Evelyn was quiet. "How many reports?" she said. 23 across the nursing staff. 6 filed by you. The others filed by 4 other nurses over the same period, all of whom either resigned or were placed on performance management within 3 months of filing. Evelyn stood in the supply corridor and looked at the shelving in front of her wound care supplies, IV equipment, the small organized inventory of a place that was supposed to heal people. 23, she said. "The assessment team is on site this morning," the woman said. "They'll need to speak with you as part of the formal review. I wanted to let you know before they approached you through the hospital." "What does this mean for the authorization?" Evelyn asked. "It means the facility is currently under conditional status. Procedure can still proceed if certain immediate corrective conditions are met. One of those conditions is confirming that the clinical oversight for the post-procedural phase is not compromised by the administrative irregularities." "Which means me," Evelyn said. "Which means you," the woman confirmed. "And it means that Director Steer's office is going to know about this assessment within the hour." Evelyn thought about Callum Steer receiving that information. She thought about what he would do with it, what his instinct would be, and whether that instinct would be to cooperate with the assessment or to try to manage the narrative before it got further than his office. She thought about Owen Gentry telling her, "This isn't over 20 minutes ago." She thought about 23 reports filed by people who had worked on that floor and then quietly disappeared from it. "Thank you for the call," she said. "Ms. Marsh, one more thing." "Yes." The assessment team's preliminary finding is that the disciplinary actions taken against the nurses who filed those reports, including your termination, appear to follow a consistent pattern. Finding is going to be in the formal report. The line went quiet for a moment. "That's not preliminary," Evelyn said. "That's a conclusion." "Yes," the woman said, "it is." Call ended. Evelyn stood in the supply corridor for a long moment, her phone in her hand, looking at nothing. Somewhere above her, an OR was being prepped for a procedure that would happen in approximately 8 hours. Somewhere on the same floor, Owen Gentry was doing his rounds. Somewhere in a corner office, Callum Steer was about to receive news that would force him to make a series of decisions he was entirely unprepared for. And somewhere in this building, she was increasingly certain there were files that had never been meant to surface, attached to names that the administration had believed were safely buried. Pushed off the wall and went back through the supply corridor door. There was a patient in Bay 7 whose pain management wasn't working, and that was where she needed to be. Everything else was coming, whether she stood in a corridor, thinking about it or not. She had learned that lesson in a very different kind of corridor, a long time ago, in a place where the walls didn't hold supplies but rubble, and the sounds outside weren't monitors, but things that made monitors seem like a very quiet kind of mercy. She had survived that. She went back to work. The Bay 7 patient's name was Harold Fitch, 61 years old, 3 days post-coronary artery bypass, and he was lying in his bed at 7:55 in the morning, doing the specific kind of not complaining that Evelyn had learned to read as a man in more pain than he was willing to admit to a stranger. She pulled a chair to his bedside rather than standing over him. Small thing. It changed the geometry of the conversation. Scale of 1 to 10, she said. He thought about it longer than he should have needed to. 6. Where chest? Left side, mostly. Radiating some. She noted that. Post-bypass, some chest discomfort was expected. Radiating discomfort on day 3, inadequately controlled, was a different category of concern. She checked his overnight medication record. The pain management order had been written for a standard post-surgical protocol that was appropriate for day 1, not updated for day 3, and nobody had flagged the gap. Has anyone come in this morning and asked you specifically about the pain level? Harold looked at the ceiling. The overnight nurse checked my monitors around 3. Didn't ask. She made the notation and stepped out to find the attending on file. It was a physician she didn't know well, a doctor. Carmela Osi, who had only been at Harlow General 8 months and who was currently running late because of a parking situation that had apparently involved one of the federal security vehicles blocking the physician lot. Evelyn reached her by phone. Fitch in Bay 7 needs a pain management reassessment, she said. Current protocol wasn't adjusted from the day 1 order. He's at a 6 and describing radiation. Is it cardiac in nature? That's what needs to be determined. I'd also recommend a 12 lead before you see him, just to rule it out clean. A brief pause. I'll be up in 15 minutes. Thank you, Evelyn said, and meant it in the specific way. She meant things when they went the way they were supposed to, not with relief, just with the quiet acknowledgement that the system had functioned correctly for once. She was back at the nursing station when Farrow appeared at the unit entrance and waved her over. The federal assessment team had set up a temporary workspace in a conference room on the 3rd floor, 4 people, 2 laptops, a printer that was apparently malfunctioning, and a stack of documents that Evelyn recognized, even from the doorway, as internal HR files. One of the 4 was a woman named Sandra Wick, who introduced herself as the lead assessor, and who had the particular manner of someone who had spent a career in institutional review, not unkind, not warm, focused in a way that made small talk feel like an interruption. We have your filed report, Sandra said. All 6. We've also pulled the corresponding disciplinary records, the HR communications, and the staffing logs for the periods in question. We need you to walk us through the sequence of events for each report. All 6? Evelyn of time. She sat down. She walked them through all 6. Took an hour and 20 minutes, during which Sandra asked precise questions, and one of the other assessors typed rapidly, and the other 2 reviewed documents, and occasionally passed things to Sandra without comment. At no point did anyone tell her she was right or wrong. At no point did anyone express surprise or sympathy or anything resembling a personal reaction. It was the most professional conversation she had been in since leaving the military, and she meant that as a genuine observation rather than a criticism. When she finished the 6th report, the staffing shortfall documentation that had ultimately ended in her termination, Sandra set her pen down. The other nurses who filed reports, Evelyn said. 4 of them. Have you spoken to them? 2 of them, Sandra said. The other 2 declined. Were they given adequate assurance that participation wouldn't affect current employment? Sandra looked at her steadily. That's a fair question. It's not rhetorical. I know. Sandra glanced at the assessor beside her. We'll make sure that's communicated clearly before we close outreach. It wasn't a full answer. Evelyn noted that without pushing it further. There was a point beyond which pressing produced defensiveness rather than results, and she had learned to feel where that line was. One more thing, Sandra said. Director Steer has requested to be present for any further assessment conversations involving current or recently reinstated staff. We've declined that request. I want you to know that. Evelyn nodded. Is there anything you haven't told us that you think we should know? Sandra asked. Evelyn thought about that for a moment. Talk to Dara Hollis, she said. She's been on the floor 14 years. She hasn't filed anything. But she's seen everything. She was back on the ICU floor by 9:40. Harold Fitch's 12 lead had come back clean, no new ischemic changes. Pain was musculoskeletal and inadequately managed. Dr. Osei had updated his protocol and ordered a reassessment in 2 hours. He was already looking better when Evelyn stopped by. He had the slightly sheepish expression of a man who had been quietly suffering and had been found out about it. "You didn't have to sit down like that," he said. "Most of them stand." "Easier to hear you," she said. "I wasn't saying much. Why I sat down." He almost smiled. She moved on. 10:15. The federal security footprint in the building expanded visibly. 2 additional agents appeared in the corridor outside the ICU. The elevator at the end of the hall was placed on restricted access. Security checkpoint was established at the stairwell door. The staff reacted to this the way medical staff generally reacted to things outside their clinical control, with a combination of professional focus and barely suppressed curiosity. Evelyn watched Priya make 3 unnecessary trips past the stairwell checkpoint before catching herself and redirecting. 10:40, Callum Steer came to the ICU for the second time. He did not bring legal counsel this time. He came alone, which was either a sign of contrition or a sign that he was trying to have a conversation he didn't want witnessed. Evelyn wasn't sure which, and she didn't assume. "I need 5 minutes," he said. She looked at the board. Nothing was immediately critical. Bay 8 family consultation is at 11. You have until 5 of... They stood at the end of the corridor, out of easy earshot of the nursing station, but not in any private space. She had chosen that deliberately. Callum looked like a man who had spent the night receiving information he hadn't asked for and couldn't put back. There were lines around his eyes that had looked like authority yesterday and looked like exhaustion today. "The assessment team," he started. "I know about the assessment," she said. "They're saying there's a pattern in the disciplinary actions." "There is a pattern in the disciplinary actions." He looked at her. Not defensive. She would have recognized defensive. This was something closer to trying to locate himself in a version of events that did not map onto the one he had been operating with. "I didn't know about the clearance," he said. "I understand that. If I had known..." "You would have made a different calculation," she said. "I know. But the reports I filed had nothing to do with the clearance. Staffing shortfalls were real whether I was federally cleared or not. Patient outcomes were real. The other nurses who filed reports and then found themselves on performance management, their situations were real. Clearance is why the federal assessment is happening. It's not why any of the rest of it happened." He absorbed that. "What do you want?" he said, not hostile, genuinely asking. "Told you what I want," she said. "I told the president. Independent safety reporting. Formal protection for nurses who escalate. Staffing reviews that aren't filtered through cost projections. Those things. That's not simple to implement, no," she said. "It's not." She looked at him. "Nothing I've asked for is simple. Simple would have been ignoring everything I saw for 12 years and keeping my head down and staying employed. I didn't do that." He was quiet. 5 of 11, she said, and walked back toward the nursing station. The OR call came at 2:17 p. M. President Voss had gone into the procedure at noon. The cardiac catheterization with planned valve assessment had been expected to take between 2 and 3 hours under optimal conditions. At 2:17, the OR coordinator called ICU to advise that the procedure had run 40 minutes longer than projected, but had concluded successfully, and that the patient would be transported to the recovery area in approximately 25 minutes. Evelyn had been ready for an hour. She had the recovery room configured, the monitoring equipment calibrated, the post-procedural medication protocol tools reviewed with Ellery's list from that morning cross-referenced against what the OR had administered. She had Jonah on one side of the room, and Priya, whom she had specifically requested for this shift, partly because Priya was competent, and partly because Priya needed to see that she was trusted on the other. The room was not perfect. The peripheral monitor she had repositioned at 2A. M was now catching a reflection from the corridor window that washed out slightly at certain angles. She made a mental note and repositioned the display. The transport team arrived at 2:49. What struck her when they brought him in was that he looked like a man. Not a symbol, not a title, not the voice she'd heard on the phone 2 days ago. Just a 63-year-old man coming out of anesthesia, slightly gray around the jaw, IV lines running, chest leads in place, moving from sedation toward awareness with the same unsteady vulnerability that every post-procedural patient had. She had seen it hundreds of times. She treated him the same way she treated Harold Fitch. She did her job. Ellery was beside her within 2 minutes of transport arrival. He reviewed the monitor readings, confirmed the post-procedural orders, and made one modification to the fluid management protocol that Evelyn had already considered and nearly flagged before he got there. Told him that. He looked at her, nodded once, and said, "Good catch." The next 90 minutes were textbook. Vitals stable. Rhythm regular. Anesthesia clearing on a normal curve. Post-procedural pain managed within appropriate parameters. No arrhythmias. Unexpected pressure drops. No signs of the rare but serious complications that Ellery had briefed her on that morning, with the kind of clinical candor that most physicians reserved for colleagues of equal standing. She stood at the monitoring station and watched the numbers with the focused patience of someone who understood that stability was not the absence of danger, but the presence of adequate response time. At 4:20, President Voss was sufficiently recovered from anesthesia to be aware of his surroundings. His eyes opened. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then moved his gaze around the room in the careful inventory of someone reconnecting with physical reality. His eyes landed on Evelyn. She was standing at the monitoring station 8 feet away, reviewing his fluid balance. She looked up when she felt the shift in the room that came when a patient became conscious. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She checked his pulse oximetry. 97%. Good. How are you feeling? She asked. The same way she would ask any patient. He thought about it for a moment. His voice was rough from the airway. Someone put a camera in my heart. They did, she said. It went well. He looked at her for another moment, something moving behind his eyes that she did not try to interpret. Bernard, he said, voice still rough. She frowned slightly. Sir? Your patient. Room 11, the man you left the note for. Stilled. Farrow briefed me, he said. The chart note. 8 minutes before your key card was deactivated. She didn't respond. I just wanted you to know that I know, he said. She looked at his monitor. 97, steady. Heart rate 62, regular. Rest, she said. We can talk about the rest later. Closed his eyes at 5:50 p.m. Callum Steer's office issued a facility-wide communication acknowledging that an external review was underway and requesting all staff to cooperate fully with assessment team requests. It was the most carefully worded capitulation Evelyn had seen since a battalion commander she'd served under had issued an equally careful acknowledgement that a logistical failure had not been the fault of the medical unit it had been blamed on. Jonah read it on his phone and looked at Evelyn. Did you know that was coming? He asked. I hoped it was, she said. Is that the same thing? Not always, she said. At 6:30, Priya came to find her with a look on her face that Evelyn had learned to read in the past 36 hours, not panic, but the particular sharpened attention of a nurse who had noticed something and was trying to determine whether it was significant. Bay 3, Priya said. Mrs. Whitmore. Her pressure's been trending down over the last 40 minutes. Nothing alarm threshold yet, but the curve? Show me, Evelyn said. Already moving. Mrs. Whitmore was 72, admitted 2 days ago, for a hypertensive crisis that had been stabilized, currently in an observation status that was supposed to be a step toward discharge. Her blood pressure at 4 p.m. had been 138/82. 5 p.m. it was 124/76. 6 p.m. it was 116/70. None of those numbers would trigger an alarm. Individually, each reading was within normal range. Pattern was what mattered, and the pattern said something was moving in the wrong direction. Get me her medication reconciliation list, Evelyn said. All of it, including what she took at home that she self-reported on admission. Priya pulled it up. Evelyn scanned it. They're a calcium channel blocker that Mrs. Whitmore had been taking at home, listed on the admission reconciliation, and an antihypertensive that had been added during the hospitalization, without a clear notation about the interaction potential. Not a clear drug interaction, not in any cut-and-dried pharmacology sense, but in a 72-year-old with a history of hypertension and current cardiovascular instability. The combination and the trending numbers formed a picture. She called Dr. Osi, who was still in the building, covering the evening rotation. I need you to look at Whitmore in Bay 3, Evelyn said. I'm not calling a code, but I don't want to wait for morning. On my way, Osi said, While she waited, she stayed in the room, checking Mrs. Whitmore's pressure manually every 4 minutes and recording it. Patient was awake, mildly anxious, asking in a thin voice whether something was wrong. "We're keeping a close eye on you," Evelyn said. "That's all." "You're in here a lot for keeping a close eye," Mrs. Whitmore said. "I'm thorough," Evelyn said. Mrs. Whitmore almost smiled. The young one who came in earlier, she was worried, too. She just didn't say it. Yes. She's good. She's afraid of something. Evelyn looked at the blood pressure cuff. She's new. She's learning not to be. "Are you afraid of something?" Evelyn thought about the question honestly for a moment. "Not tonight," she said. It wasn't entirely true. But it was true enough for the moment, which was all she was trying to manage. O.C. arrived at 6:51. She assessed Mrs. Whitmore, reviewed the medication reconciliation, and agreed with Evelyn's read. She ordered a modification to the antihypertensive dosing and increased monitoring frequency. By 7:30, Mrs. Whitmore's pressure had leveled at 119/73 and was holding. Not a crisis averted dramatically. Not a rescue. Just a pattern noticed, a concern raised, a physician called, a dosage adjusted, a patient who would not know how close the curve had gotten to something worse. This was what the work looked like from the inside. It looked like Priya noticing a trend and deciding to speak up rather than wait. It looked like an attending who came when she was called. It looked like numbers on a screen at 30-minute intervals that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't watching them. Evelyn stood in the corridor outside Bay 3 at 7:45 and allowed herself 30 seconds to be tired. Then she walked back to the nursing station. 8:03 p.m. Owen Gentry came back. He was not on call. His shift had ended at 5. His presence on the floor at 8 p.m. was not, by itself. Unusual physicians came and went according to patient needs, not clock-out times. But he came in the way people came in when they had a purpose that had nothing to do with the patients, moving through the unit with the slightly too deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it. He stopped in front of the nursing station. Evelyn looked up. "I'd like to discuss the Bay 1 patient," he said. "Mr. Fitch." Dr. O.C. adjusted his pain management protocol this morning, Evelyn said. "He's been reassessed twice. He's doing well." "I'm aware of what O.C. ordered," Gentry said. "I'm his primary." "I know you are." "Then you know the protocol change should have come through me." Evelyn looked at him. The protocol change came through the attending on duty because the patient was in inadequately managed pain at 7:50 a.m. and needed an adjustment that morning. "Were you available at 7:50 a.m.? I could have been reached." "The process is to contact the attending on duty for a non-emergency clinical decision," she said. "That's what happened." He leaned slightly forward on the counter. Not threatening or trying not to appear threatening. But there was something coiled in his posture that she had learned to recognize in certain kinds of men, the ones who had confused being challenged with being attacked for so long that they could no longer tell the difference. "You've been back on this floor for 24 hours, he said quietly, "and you've already generated an external assessment, a federal security review, a facility-wide memo, and apparently a direct line to the cardiologist of someone I'm not supposed to name. You think that looks like a nurse doing her job?" "I think it looks like exactly that," she said. "It looks like someone running a campaign." "Dr. Gentry," she kept her voice level, "caught a medication error, a deteriorating patient, and an inadequate pain protocol today, all before noon. If those things look like a campaign, the problem isn't my agenda. The problem is what those things were doing there in the first place." Stared at her. "The assessment team has my files," she said, "including the 2 complaints you filed. I'd imagine they'd be interested in talking to you." Color in his face shifted slightly. Not obvious, she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. "You think this is going to end with you as some kind of hero," he said. "Think about it like that," she said honestly. "Think about the patient in Bay 7 and the patient in Bay 3 and the potassium level that nobody ordered a follow-up on. That's what I think about." He turned and walked out. Jonah, who had witnessed the last 30 seconds of the conversation from a distance and had clearly reconstructed the rest of it from Evelyn's expression, came over when the doors had closed. "Going to make a complaint," Jonah said. "Probably," Evelyn said. "Before or after the assessment report comes out. If he's smart before." She turned back to the board. "He's not always smart." The call came at 9:47 p.m. It was Pharaoh. His voice had a quality she had heard before, and people who were managing very bad information in very real time not alarmed, because alarm was a luxury just tightly contained, every word carrying precise weight. It was a situation, he said. Not medical. Security. She stepped back into the supply corridor. Tell me. Credible threat communication was received by the Office of Presidential Security at 9:17. We're assessing its validity now. Standard protocol is to secure the facility and evaluate evacuation options. Evacuation, she said, of a post-procedural cardiac patient who has been out of the OR for 7 hours. I know. Pharaoh. Moving him right now carries significant clinical risk. His hemodynamics are stable, but his vessels are still in an acute healing phase. Transport stress. I know, he said again. That's why I'm calling you before I call Ellery. I need to know what the clinical floor looks like. What we're actually working with if we have to move. She thought fast. Not about the right answer. The right answer was that moving the president right now was a bad medical idea. She thought about the variables. The corridor security layout, the elevator access, the logistics of transport under a genuine threat scenario with a compromised patient. If you're moving him, she said, you do it by internal transfer to a secured internal space, not external evacuation. This building has a basement radiology suite that's been offline since March. Here, no external access points. Climate-controlled. Closer to the ICU than the main exit. A pause. That's not a standard evacuation option. No. But standard evacuation options were designed for ambulatory patients and staff. They were not designed for a patient 4 centimeters into a cardiac healing cycle. She heard him relaying something to someone else in the background. Hold, he said. She held. The supply corridor was quiet. She could hear the distant monitor rhythm from the ICU through the door, steady as a pulse. Pharaoh came back. Ellery agrees with your assessment. We're going with the internal option, pending threat validation. What's the validation timeline? 40 minutes. Maybe less. Okay. I need you on the floor, he said. If validation comes back and we need to move, you're directing the clinical side of the transport. Not a coordinator, not the charge nurse, you. I'm already on the floor, she said. She ended the call and stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. Not gathering herself, she was already gathered. Just marking the moment before it became something she would be inside rather than looking at. Pushed the door open and walked back to the ICU. Jonah looked up when she came in, read her face. What is it? He said. Get me the transport equipment checklist, she said. Find out when the last bed mobility assessment was done, on the patient in the recovery room. He didn't ask why. He moved. Priya looked across the unit at her. What do you need me to do? Priya asked. Evelyn looked at her, this young nurse, who had been afraid of her own instincts 2 days ago, who had come to her with the Whitmore blood pressure trend, because she had decided that speaking up was worth the risk of being wrong. Stay with Mrs. Whitmore, Evelyn said. Check her pressure every 10 minutes. If it trends below 110 systolic, call me directly. Not the nursing station. My cell. Got it, Priya said. And Priya. The younger nurse looked at her. You did good today. Priya pressed her lips together briefly, a complicated expression that Evelyn didn't try to interpret, and turned toward Bay 3. Evelyn moved to the recovery room. The president was awake again. Color was better than it had been at 4:40. He was watching the monitor above his bed with the focused attention of a man who had learned to read data under pressure. Your numbers look good, she said. Your expression doesn't, he said. She looked at him. He was still hoarse, still moving carefully, still clearly a man whose body had been through something significant in the last 8 hours. There may be a situation that requires us to move you to a different location in the building, she said. That happens. I'll tell you exactly what we're doing and why before we do anything. And I need you to tell me immediately if you feel anything change, chest pressure, shortness of breath, dizziness, anything. He held her gaze. How serious? 40 minutes before I know more. He nodded, just once. The same economy of motion she remembered from 17 years ago, a man who did not waste movement when clarity would do. Trust your read, he said. She didn't respond to that. Not because she didn't hear it, but because the right response was to be good at her job. And she turned back to the monitor and began reviewing the last 30 minutes of data, with the attention of someone who was going to make a decision that mattered. Outside in the corridor, 2 agents repositioned quietly. In the supply room, Jonah was pulling the transport checklist. And somewhere in the administrative offices of Harlow General, a different kind of threat was still sitting in a stack of files, 23 reports, 4 nurses, pattern as clear as blood pressure, trending downward, waiting for the people who had buried it, that the assessment team was not going to leave without reading every page. 38 minutes. Evelyn counted the president's pulse against the monitor readout. 63 beats per minute. Steady. She watched the door. 38 minutes passed the way bad minutes always passed. Not slowly, not quickly, but in the particular stretched-out compression of sustained alertness where each second had a texture to it. Evelyn stood at the monitoring station and watched the numbers and did not think about the threat communication, or what it might mean, or whether validation would come back clean. She thought about the data in front of her. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate. The 4-variable picture of a man's cardiovascular system in the early hours of recovery, and whether any of those 4 variables was going to require her attention in the next 38 minutes. None of them did. At 10:24, Farrow appeared at the recovery room door. Threat communication was a false positive, he said. Validation complete. No credible basis. We're standing down. She let out a breath through her nose. Not relief exactly, more like the release of a sustained muscular contraction. Patient is stable. No transport needed. Confirmed. Then I'd like to keep the corridor configuration as is through the overnight, she said, even with stand down. Farrow looked at her for a moment. That's not standard post-clearance protocol. No, she said. But the patient is 7 hours post-procedure, and we're in a building that is currently under external federal assessment and has documented internal reporting failures. I'd rather oversecure tonight and normalize tomorrow. He considered that for 3 seconds. I'll clear it. He left. The president, who had been lying with his eyes partially open during the exchange, said without moving, "You didn't ask my opinion." "You're the patient," she said, "not the security director. Technically, I outrank. Technically, in this room, you have a pulse oximeter on your finger, and I have the authority to decide when you get to have opinions." She adjusted the fluid drip. Sleep. He actually did. The overnight was quiet in the specific way that follows a near miss, not peaceful but exhausted, the whole floor running on adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. Jonah worked the back half of the shift with the focused quietness of a man who had decided not to process anything until he was off the clock. Priya checked Mrs. Whitmore's pressure every 10 minutes, documented it every time, and did not call Evelyn once, because Mrs. Whitmore's numbers held. At 2 a.m., Evelyn sat in the break room for 18 minutes and ate a sandwich that someone had left in the refrigerator with a sticky note that said, "Please eat this, Marsh Jonah." She ate it without tasting most of it, looking at the wall, letting her mind go loose for the first time in 2 days. She thought about the 23 reports Sandra Wick's team had in their folder, thought about the 4 nurses who had filed them, and then quietly disappeared from the floor. She thought about the one Dara Hollis had never filed 14 years of watching. Nothing in writing, the particular institutional knowledge of a woman who had learned that the cost of speaking outweighed the benefit. She thought about Priya, checking blood pressure every 10 minutes, because someone had told her her instincts mattered. At 2:18, she went back to the floor. The assessment team's preliminary findings arrived at 7:15 the next morning in a document that Sandra Wick hand-delivered to the hospital board chair, a man named Gerald Ferris, who had the look of someone who had not slept much either, and who read the first 3 pages, standing in his own doorway, before he stepped aside to let Sandra in. Evelyn was not in that room. She heard about it the way she heard about most things, through the particular information ecology of a hospital floor, where nothing stayed contained for very long. Jonah heard it from a surgical nurse who had overheard 2 board members in the elevator. Jonah told Evelyn at 7:45 while she was reviewing the morning labs. "Preliminary findings," she said. "Preliminary findings," he confirmed, which apparently include a recommendation for immediate external review of disciplinary actions going back 36 months. She looked at the lab report in her hand. "Potassium for the patient in Bay 4, finally within range. That's longer than I filed reports for," she said. "They pulled older records too," Jonah said. "Apparently they found a nurse who left in 2021, filed 2 safety complaints, both archived without action, performance managed, 6 months later, resigned." Evelyn looked at him. "Her name was Vera Nance," Jonah said quietly. "She was one of the best nurses on this floor." "I don't know if you knew her." "I knew her," Evelyn said. She set the lab report down. Vera Nance had been gone 3 years. Evelyn had not thought about her in a year and a half, which was its own kind of failure she was willing to sit with. Vera had been methodical, patient, and possessed of the specific gift of communicating bad news to families in a way that left them with something to hold on to rather than just the bad news. She had left suddenly, and the explanation offered was that she had found a position closer to family, and Evelyn had accepted that the way you accepted the exits that didn't quite add up, because asking too many questions about them felt like picking at something that might not survive the picking. Now it turned out the thing that might not have survived the picking was the administration that had engineered the exit. She picked up the phone and called Sandra Wick. "Vera Nance," she said when Sandra answered. "She's been contacted," Sandra said. She agreed to submit a written statement. "Good. Miss Marsh, the preliminary findings are going to be released to the board this morning and to hospital leadership by noon. I want you to know that your name appears in the document not as a complainant, but as a corroborating subject. The language is specific. The findings are clear. What happens to the disciplinary records? Formal expungement recommendation for any disciplinary action shown to be linked to patient safety reporting. That includes yours." Evelyn stood at the nursing station and looked at the board, the patient names, the room numbers, the color-coded status indicators that told her at a glance what the floor looked like and what it needed. "The other nurses who filed reports," she said. "The ones who are still here. Protected under the review," Sandra said. "Any retaliation from this point forward triggers federal employment violation proceedings. I want that communicated to them directly. Not through department heads. Directly. We'll make sure of it." She hung up. At 9:05, Callum Steer called an all-staff meeting. He did this through the standard intercom system, requesting department heads and floor supervisors to gather in the main conference room at 9:30. It was a broad enough request to feel administrative rather than urgent, but the timing the morning after a federal assessment team had spent 36 hours in the building made its actual meaning clear to anyone paying attention. Evelyn did not go. She was on the floor, and the floor needed coverage, and her presence in a conference room where Callum Steer was managing institutional optics was not something the patients in the ICU required from her. She sent Jonah because Jonah wanted to go, and because having someone there who could report back was useful. He returned at 10:15. "He's resigning," Jonah said. She looked up. "Steer. Effective end of month." He framed it as a personal decision. Said he was proud of the work done at Harlow General, believed in its mission, felt it was time for new leadership to guide the hospital through an important transition. Jonah paused. He said it in his director voice. Nobody believed a word of it. "Gentry?" "Not at the meeting," I asked around. "Apparently he's been placed on administrative review by the department chief. Something to do with the complaint he filed against you yesterday. Turns out when the assessment team cross-referenced it with his previous complaints and the patient outcomes associated with them, the timing didn't look coincidental." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "How many people were in the room?" she asked. "Maybe 40. Department heads, floor supervisors, 2 board members. How did they react?" Jonah thought about it, he said. Not shocked quiet. More like the kind of quiet when something finally gets said that everyone already knew and nobody wanted to be the first to acknowledge. She understood that kind of quiet. She had sat in it a few times herself. At 11:40, Dr. Ellery came to the recovery room with a discharge plan. President Voss's overnight readings had remained stable. His post-procedural inflammation markers were within expected range, cardiac rhythm consistent, blood pressure responding appropriately. Ellery had reviewed the full overnight data and conferred with the OR team, and the clinical picture supported a transfer to a secure external medical facility for the remainder of his recovery, one that was specifically equipped for the security requirements that Harlow General could not permanently maintain. Evelyn agreed with the assessment. Spent 40 minutes with the transport team, reviewing the transfer protocol, the medication schedule, the monitoring parameters that the receiving facility would need to maintain, and the specific indicators that should trigger escalation. She wrote a clinical summary that was 4 pages long and included every variable she had tracked over the past 18 hours. Not because the receiving team needed that much detail, but because the president deserved a handoff document that left nothing to interpretation. Ellery read it before she sent it. "This is thorough," he said. "Came out of a cardiac procedure 7 hours ago," she said. "Thorough is appropriate. More thorough than what most attendings would produce." "I'm not an attending." "No," he said. He looked at her for a moment. I've worked with nurses in this specialty for 30 years. I can count on one hand the ones I'd trust to produce this kind of clinical picture without physician review. She looked at the document. It still needs your signature. I know. He signed it. That's the part that needs to change. She looked at him. At a systemic level, he said carefully. Not just here. The way clinical expertise in nursing is categorized and compensated and listened to. That needs to change. Yes, she said, it does. He left. She stood at the nursing station and looked at the signed document and thought about what it would take to change the thing he was describing, and whether what was happening in this building right now was the beginning of that or just an isolated correction. And she did not have an answer to that question, which was uncomfortable but honest. Put the document in the transfer folder and moved on. President's transfer happened at 1:15 p.m. It was quiet. The transport team came in through the restricted elevator, 3 agents and 2 medical personnel from the receiving facility who had been credentialed and cleared. Evelyn gave the handoff verbally to the lead medical officer, a woman named Dr. Petrasad, who asked 3 follow-up questions, all of them good ones, while Jonah and a transport nurse disconnected monitoring leads and transferred IVs with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 100 times. Before they moved him, the president looked at Evelyn. I'd like a moment, he said. She stepped to the bedside. He didn't have a speech. She had half expected one. He was, among other things, a man whose profession was structured communication. Instead, he said, quietly, when this is behind us, the procedure, the assessment, all of it, I'm going to make sure the right people hear what happened here. The assessment team is already, not just the assessment team, he said, the right people, the ones who can make it permanent instead of just corrective. She looked at him. I told you on the phone, she said, that I wasn't coming back because you asked. I meant it. I know. So I don't need you to. I know you don't need it, he said. I'm going to do it anyway. Not for you. For the next one. The next nurse who sees something real and gets a disciplinary file instead of a response. Quiet. That's different, she said. Yes, he said. It is. They moved him out at 1:15. She watched the transport team take the corridor toward the elevator and did not feel what she might have expected. Not triumph, not emotion, not the particular release of something that had been held too long. She felt the floor under her feet and the quiet of the recovery room and the low-grade exhaustion of a person who had been running on minimal sleep for 2 days and still had 6 hours left on the clock. She went back to work. The board's formal response to the assessment came at 2:47 p.m. It was a 3-page document which Gerald Ferris distributed via email to department heads and which reached the nursing stations by way of the same information ecology that everything else moved through. Jonah forwarded it to Evelyn's phone at 2:52. She read it in the medication room, standing up, between a potassium infusion check and an antibiotic timing adjustment. The document acknowledged the preliminary assessment findings. It acknowledged the pattern of disciplinary actions identified in the external review. It announced the formation of an independent oversight committee for patient safety reporting, the immediate suspension of all pending disciplinary actions connected to the flagged reports, and the formal reinstatement with full back pay of any staff member whose termination had been linked to safety reporting activity. The last paragraph announced Callum Steer's departure. It did not use the word resignation. It used the phrase transition of leadership, which was the institutional equivalent of the same thing, and fooled no one. Evelyn read the document twice. It was not everything. The Oversight Committee was new, and its independence would depend on how it was structured and who sat on it, and whether it had actual authority or just the appearance of authority. The back pay reinstatements were corrective, not preventive. The pattern that had produced 23 buried reports and 4 disappeared nurses was not automatically undone by a 3-page document, any more than a building was undone by finding the flaw in the foundation. You had to rebuild from that flaw up, and that was a different kind of work than discovery. Put her phone back in her pocket and finished the potassium check. At 3:15, Owen Gentry came to the floor for the 3rd time. He did not have his attendings walk this time. He had the careful, slightly reduced posture of a man who had received information that had altered his self-presentation, not completely, not permanently, but enough to be visible if you were watching. Stopped at the nursing station. Evelyn was there. I've been informed, he said, that the department chief has placed my complaint against you under administrative review. I heard, she said. I also understand that the complaints I filed previously have been included in the assessment team's cross-reference. Yes. He looked at the counter between them. I'm not going to pretend I agree with how this has been handled. You don't have to, she said. I'm going to say. He stopped. Tried again. The Garrison case. In February. You were right. I know you were right. I knew it then and I didn't say so. It was not an apology. It was a man stopping at the edge of an apology and staying there, unable to step across. She recognized it. She had seen it before in people who were not bad people, but who had been wrong for long enough, in specific enough ways that the acknowledgement of it cost them something they couldn't fully afford to pay. Okay, she said. He looked at her, waiting for more. That's all I've got for you right now, she said. 3 patients to check before 4 o'clock. He nodded once and walked away. It was Dara Hollis who found the file. At 4:30, Dara came to Evelyn with an expression she had never seen on Dara's face before, not the careful neutrality, not the protective stillness. Something open and slightly stunned, like a woman who had just heard a door she'd assumed was locked, click-free. I talked to the assessment team, Dara said. Sandra Wick. Good, Evelyn said. I told her everything. 14 years. Everything I saw and didn't report. She stopped, pressed her lips together. She showed me something. A file. A communication chain from 2022. Evelyn looked at her. Between Steer and the HR director, Dara said. An email chain. They were discussing a nurse who had filed a second safety complaint, Vera Nance. And Steer's response to the HR director in writing was, she stopped again, looked at the floor, then back up. He said, let's make sure the environment becomes uncomfortable enough that she finds her own way out. In writing, the unit was quiet around them. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms. Sandra has it, Dara said. It's in the formal record now. She said it was the clearest example of documented retaliation she'd encountered in 3 years of these assessments. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. She thought about Vera Nance, who had communicated with families in a way that left them something to hold on to, who had filed 2 complaints and found the environment had been deliberately made uncomfortable, who had left and been replaced by an explanation about family. Is Vera's statement in the record? Evelyn asked. Yes. Sandra confirmed it. Good. Dara looked at her. I should have said something 3 years ago. Yes, Evelyn said. Not cruel. Not forgiving either, just accurate. You should have. Dara absorbed that without flinching. I know. What are you going to do now? Evelyn asked. Dara looked at the floor, then at the unit around her, the board, the rooms, the patients, the equipment. 14 years of landscape she had moved through carefully, keeping her head at exactly the right height. I'm going to stop being careful about the wrong things, she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was a quiet sentence from a tired woman who had made a choice, and it had more weight than most declarations Evelyn had heard because of that. Start with Bay 2, Evelyn said. The patient there has been asking for a case manager since this morning, and nobody's followed up. Dara went. At 5:40 p.m., Renata Kuhl from HR came to the floor. Evelyn was at the nursing station. She saw Renata coming and recognized the specific walk of someone who had not chosen to be here and was managing that. Renata stopped at the counter. I've been asked to inform you, Renata said, that the HR director has submitted his resignation effective immediately, and that the board has engaged outside legal counsel to review the totality of the disciplinary records. Evelyn looked at her. All of them. All disciplinary actions involving nursing staff over the past 5 years. Renata paused. Your records will be formally cleared as part of the first phase of review. You'll receive written confirmation. And the others. All staff identified in the assessment findings are being contacted individually. Evelyn nodded. Renata didn't move. I want to say, Renata started. You don't have to, Evelyn said. I was following a process, Renata said. When I sat in that room with you and Director Steer, following the process I had been given. I know that. That doesn't make it right. No, Evelyn said. It doesn't. Renata nodded. She turned and walked back toward the elevator. Evelyn watched her go and thought about processes, about how much damage could be done by a person who was simply following one, who never asked what the process was designed to accomplish, who treated the procedure as the thing rather than a means to something. She thought about this for about 30 seconds. Then her phone buzzed. It was Priya. Text message Bay 5. New admission. 44-year-old post-cardiac arrest transfer from Dunmore Regional. ETA 12 minutes. They're saying he's stable, but the transport notes look off. Evelyn looked at the message. Read it again. She typed back. What specifically looks off? Priya's response took 20 seconds. Heart rate is 61, but they've got him on a lidocaine drip that should be pushing it higher. And the transport note says his BP at departure was 110/68, but that was 2 hours ago. Nobody checked en route. Evelyn was already moving before she finished reading. A 44-year-old post-cardiac arrest patient, 2 hours without a blood pressure, reading, on an antiarrhythmic that was suppressing his rate in a way that didn't match the listed dosage. She pushed through the ICU doors at a controlled walk, not a run. Because running in an ICU before you know what you're running toward was how you started making errors, and found Priya at the nursing station printing the incoming transfer summary. She took the papers from Priya's hands. She read the transport documentation in 30 seconds. The lidocaine dosage listed was 0.7 milligrams per kilogram per minute. Patient's listed weight was 83 kilograms. She did the math in her head. Then she looked at the transport notes again, specifically at the line where the departure nurse had initialed the drip confirmation. The initials were smudged. The dosage field had been overwritten. Faintly, under the correction, she could see a different number, a higher number, a number that, if accurate, meant the patient had been receiving nearly double the documented lidocaine dose for the past 2 hours, and that his heart rate of 61 was not a stable post-arrest rhythm but a suppressed one, and that his blood pressure 2 hours ago of 110/68 might now be something considerably worse. She looked at Priya. Call ahead to transport, she said. Get a current blood pressure right now. Tell them to stop the drip and hold it until we confirm the rate. Priya was already on the phone. Evelyn stood at the nursing station with the transfer summary in her hand and looked at the smudged initials on the dosage line and felt the particular cold clarity she had learned to trust in herself, the one that had nothing to do with certainty, and everything to do with the recognition that something was very wrong, and there was a specific window in which doing the right thing was still possible. Transport was 12 minutes out. She picked up the phone to call Dr. Osi. And that was when Jonah appeared at the door to the nursing station with his phone in his hand, looking at her with an expression that stopped her mid-motion. What? She said. The assessment team just sent a supplemental finding to the board, he said. Something they found in Steer's files after he cleared his office. She waited. There's a communication, Jonah said slowly, from 14 months ago, between Steer and a physician on staff, planning the personnel action against you, specifically, by name. He looked at his phone. The physician is Gentry, and the communication discusses ensuring your safety reports were archived before they reached external review channels, and making sure the next complaint cycle gave them enough documentation to justify termination. The break room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, the elevator chimed. Transport was arriving. Evelyn put the phone to her ear and waited for Osa to pick up, and she looked at Jonah, and she thought about a communication from 14 months ago between two men who had decided she was a problem to be managed, and she thought about what it meant that they had put it in writing, and she thought about the email Dara had described. Let's make sure the environment becomes uncomfortable enough that she finds her own way out. They had not just fired her, they had planned it, and they had planned it because she had been right, and they had known she was right. And the reports she was filing were not the insubordination of a difficult employee, but the documentation of failures they could not afford to have documented. Osi, she said when the line connected, I need you in the ICU right now. Incoming transfer, post-cardiac arrest, possible lidocaine toxicity. I'll explain when you get here. She hung up and walked toward the incoming bay. Transport doors opened at the end of the hall. The patient was already paler than his transfer notes had described. His name was Daniel Rourke, and he was 44 years old, and he was the color of old wax. Transport team moved him through the ICU doors at 5:53 p.m. with the particular controlled urgency of people who had been told the patient was stable, and were now looking at a patient who was not stable and were revising their understanding of the situation in real time. Evelyn met them at the bay entrance, took one look at Rourke's skin tone and the slight irregularity in his breathing pattern, and made 3 decisions before he was fully transferred to the ICU bed. Stop the drip, she said to the transport nurse. Right now. The order says to maintain until physician. I'm telling you to stop it, she said. The dosage on that transfer sheet has been corrected over. I need it stopped while we establish what he actually received." Transport nurse looked at her, looked at the sheet, and stopped the drip. Dr. Osi arrived 40 seconds later. Evelyn handed her the transfer documentation and pointed at the overwritten dosage field without a word. Osi held the paper up to the overhead light, tilted it, and her expression shifted from professional attention to something sharper. "Get me a stat lidocaine level," Osi said, "and a 12 lead." Now Priya moved. Jonah moved. Evelyn positioned herself at Rourke's left side and began a manual assessment pulse rate, rhythm quality, skin temperature, responsiveness. Pulse was slow and had a quality to it that she did not like, a slight hesitations between beats that the monitor was registering but that felt different under her fingers than it looked on the screen. "Mr. Rourke," she said close to his face, "can you hear me? I need you to squeeze my hand." A pause, then a weak pressure against her fingers. Barely there, but present. "Good," she said. "Stay with me." 12 lead printed at 6:01. OC read it at the bedside. "Widened QRS," she said. "He's got lidocaine toxicity. Mild to moderate, but it's there." She was already reaching for the phone. "I need sodium bicarb. I need it now. And I need the crash cart staged outside this bay." "Already staged," Evelyn said, because she had staged it when Priya had first texted her, before the transport arrived. Because that was what you did when a transfer note looked wrong. You prepared for the version where it was worse than the paperwork said. OC looked at her briefly. Not a thank you. There wasn't time for that. Just the look of a physician who had been given what she needed before she asked for it, which in a medical crisis was worth more than any expression of gratitude. The next 22 minutes were the kind that Evelyn had navigated enough times to know that they were not navigable through certainty. You move through them on training and attention and the willingness to change course the moment the data changed. Rourke's QRS narrowed in response to the sodium bicarbonate. Blood pressure, which had been 94/60, when the transport team had finally taken it in the elevator, began to climb. His heart rate steadied from the hesitating rhythm into something more regular, not perfect but acceptable, the cardiac equivalent of a vehicle that had been sputtering, finding its engine again. 23. OC looked at the monitor and said, "He's stabilizing." Evelyn looked at the monitor and said nothing, because she had learned not to announce stabilization until it had sustained itself for more than 3 minutes, and because she had also learned that the moment you said a thing was over was frequently the moment it reminded you it wasn't. 26, she said. "He's stabilizing." OC almost smiled. "You make me wait every time." 3 minutes is not a long time to wait, Evelyn said. "No," OC said. "It's not." Rourke was sedated and monitored through the evening. The formal incident report on the transfer documentation was filed at 7:15 by OSE, with Evelyn listed as the clinical observer who had identified the dosage discrepancy. The transport service was notified. The overwritten dosage field was photographed and preserved. Whether it was an error or something worse would be determined by people outside Harlow General, and Evelyn did not spend energy trying to determine which her job had been to catch it. And she had caught it, and Rourke was breathing steadily in Bay 5, and that was what mattered right now. She left the ICU at 8 p.m. for the first time in nearly 12 hours. She went to the break room, drank half a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made in another era, and sat in the plastic chair and let herself stop moving for 10 minutes. She was not all right in any uncomplicated sense. She was upright and functional and had been doing her job for 2.5 days on a cumulative sleep deficit that was beginning to affect the quality of her thoughts at the edges. Her feet hurt in a specific way that suggested she had been ignoring them for longer than she should have. She had eaten Jonah's sandwich at 2 in the morning and a granola bar 36 hours before that, and nothing else she could specifically remember. She was also, for the first time since Callum Steers, folded hands across a desk. Something that was not quite fine, but was closer to it than anything she had felt in a long time. A version of settled. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't. Not fully, but because the direction of things had shifted, and the shift felt real, rather than provisional. She finished the coffee. She went back to the floor. The formal board meeting happened the next morning at 9 a.m. Evelyn was not invited, and did not expect to be. She was in the ICU, covering the tail end of a night shift that had run long, because one of the incoming day nurses had called out sick and the per diem coordinator was still working on a replacement. She heard about the meeting's outcomes at 10:40 when Gerald Ferris, the board chair, walked onto the ICU floor himself. She had not seen Ferris in person before. He was in his late 60s, with the deliberate manner of a man who had learned that arriving somewhere himself communicated more than sending a representative, and who used that selectively. Came to the nursing station. "Ms. Marsh," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" She looked at the board. Rourke was stable and had been assessed 20 minutes ago. Mrs. Whitmore was sleeping with good numbers. Harold Fitch was, by all available evidence, finally comfortable for the first time since his surgery. The floor was in this specific moment holding. "A few," she said. They stood at the end of the corridor, which was her preferred location for conversations she didn't want performed in front of the full nursing station. And Ferris told her what the board had decided. Callum Steer's resignation had been accepted. The HR director's resignation had been accepted. Owen Gentry's case had been referred to the hospital's medical staff credentialing committee, which operated independently of administration, for formal review of the patient outcome concerns identified in the assessment cross-reference. The committee's findings would determine whether his clinical privileges were maintained, restricted, or revoked. That process would take 60 to 90 days, and its outcome was not something Ferris could predict or guarantee. The Oversight Committee for Patient Safety Reporting would be chaired by an external appointee, a former state health department official who had no prior relationship with Harlow General. Its first action would be to establish a direct reporting channel that bypassed all hospital administration, with findings routed to the committee and to the state health authority simultaneously. Every disciplinary action flagged in the assessment findings was being formally expunged. Pay for terminated staff whose exits were linked to safety reporting activity was being processed. Vera Nance had been contacted by the board directly, with a formal written acknowledgement of what had been done to her and an offer of reinstatement if she chose it. Evelyn listened to all of this without interrupting. "The communication between Steer and Gentry," she said when he finished. "The one from 14 months ago. It's in the formal record," Ferris said. "Our legal team has it. The state medical board has been notified regarding Dr. Gentry's portion. The communication constitutes evidence of deliberate interference with patient safety reporting, which triggers a mandatory reporting obligation. Mandatory reporting to whom? The state health authority. And given that several of the suppressed reports involved conditions that met federal facility standards thresholds, the Office of Healthcare Inspections has also been notified." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not just a hospital-level consequence," she said. "No," Ferris said. "It's not." She looked at the board at the end of the corridor. The patient names, the room numbers, the color codes. The floor she had worked for 9 years, that had tried to remove her, that she had walked back into carrying nothing but the same skill set she had always had. "There's one more thing," Ferris said. "The board would like to offer you the position of ICU nursing director, effective as soon as you're willing to accept." She looked at him. "The salary structure, the reporting relationships, the scope of authority, all of those are negotiable," he said. "We understand you may have conditions." "I do," she said. "We'd like to hear them." "Not today," she said. "I'm working a floor that's one nurse short, and I have a patient in Bay 5 who needs a reassessment in 20 minutes. We can have that conversation when I'm not the only person standing between this floor and a gap." Ferris blinked. Then he did something she had not expected. He nodded, without pushing, without adding a qualifier, without the particular administrative reflex of a man who was used to being the most important thing in any given room. "When you're ready," he said. He left. Jonah, who had been doing a very convincing impression of someone who was not listening from 11 feet away, turned to face her. He said. "Not yet," she said, "but maybe." Picked up the reassessment checklist for Bay 5. "Get me the overnight fluid balance on Rourke. And check in with Priya. She should be here in 20 minutes, and she's going to need a handoff that actually covers everything." She stood at the nursing station for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at nothing in particular. Director. The word had a shape she hadn't held before, not in this context. She had held rank before in a different uniform, in a different kind of hierarchy, in situations where the stakes were different and the same and impossible to compare neatly. She had held responsibility that was larger than her official title for 9 years on this floor, filing reports no one acted on, flagging problems no one thanked her for, watching the gap between what the institution said it was and what it actually did, and refusing to stop talking about it, even when talking about it cost her. The directorship was the institution finally saying it knew the difference between the two things and was choosing the honest version. She wasn't sure she trusted that yet. That was honest. Trust was not a switch. It was a thing you rebuilt through evidence, and there was not yet enough evidence. But there was the beginning of it, which was more than there had been 72 hours ago. She went to check on Rourke. 3 weeks passed. They passed the way hospital time always passed, not in dramatic arcs, but in the accumulated weight of small decisions, each shift bleeding into the next. The floor's rhythm absorbing the changes, the way a body absorbed new medication, slowly, not always smoothly, with occasional backslides and corrections. Evelyn accepted the directorship on a Tuesday afternoon in a conversation with Ferris that lasted 45 minutes and produced a written agreement covering 3 specific structural changes she had refused to negotiate away. The first was the independent safety reporting channel, already underway through the Oversight Committee, but now formalized in the ICU's own internal protocol, a direct line to the committee that any nurse could access without routing through charge nurses, department heads, or administrative approval. Anonymous if they needed it to be, documented regardless. The second was a formal second opinion protection policy. Any nurse who requested a physician reassessment of a patient's condition could do so without the request being logged as a negative performance indicator. Culture of implicit punishment for speaking up, which had never existed in any policy document, but had existed in practice, with the efficiency of an unwritten law, needed a written counter. The third was a staffing model review, conducted by an external firm, with binding minimums tied to patient acuity rather than budget cycles. This one took the longest to negotiate because it cost real money, and Ferris was not in a position to simply agree to an open-ended financial commitment, back and forth on it for 20 minutes. Evelyn did not move from her position. Eventually, Ferris agreed to a binding floor, a minimum below which staffing could not drop regardless of budget pressure, and a quarterly review to adjust the model based on patient load data. She signed the agreement. She told no one she had signed it that day. She went back to the floor and worked the rest of the shift, and when Jonah asked, at the end of the day, how the meeting had gone, she said, "We agreed on terms," and left it at that. Owen Gentry's credentialing review concluded in 58 days, which was faster than the projected timeline and suggested the committee had found what they were looking for without needing to dig very hard. Clinical privileges were suspended pending a corrective action plan that required direct supervision for all patient care decisions for a period of 6 months. The supervision requirement was not a slap on the wrist, it was a fundamental alteration of his professional autonomy, kind of restriction that followed a physician through his record and affected future credentialing applications at any institution he applied to. It was not a firing. It was something that, in a certain sense, required him to live with the weight of it in a way that a clean termination did not. Evelyn heard about the outcome from Jonah, the same way she heard about most things. She did not feel satisfaction, in the way that satisfaction was usually described, bright and warm and conclusive. She felt something quieter. The recognition that a specific wrong had been named correctly, attached to a consequence proportionate to it, and entered into a record that would outlast everyone involved. That was not triumph. It was closer to the absence of a pressure she had been carrying. So long she had stopped noticing it was there. State Health Authority's investigation into the suppressed reports expanded in scope 3 weeks after it began. It became, by the end of its second month, an inquiry not just into Harlow General, but into the broader pattern of how safety reports from nursing staff were handled across the state's hospital network. The investigators found, unsurprisingly, that Harlow General was not the only institution where the math worked out this way, where nurses who reported problems found themselves managed out, where the mechanism of suppression was not dramatic or overt, but simply procedural, a series of small bureaucratic decisions that added up to silence. This was not news to anyone who had worked a hospital floor for more than 5 years. It was news to the people who wrote the regulations, or at least they found it useful to treat it as news, which had the same practical effect. Evelyn was interviewed twice by the state investigators. She gave them what they asked for and did not editorialize. The facts, laid in order, were editorializing enough. Vera Nance called on a Thursday evening. Evelyn was at home, which was still a place she was relearning the habit of being the apartment that had felt empty the morning she'd sat down to update her resume. Now felt different, not full exactly, but purposeful in a way that emptiness was not. Vera's voice was careful when she started, the voice of a woman who had prepared what she was going to say and was now finding that preparation didn't quite cover the actual experience of saying it. I got the board's letter, she said. The written acknowledgement. I know. I heard you were contacted. It was a pause. I didn't expect it to be so specific. It named what they did. It didn't just say there had been a process error or a miscommunication. It said what they did. Yes, Evelyn said. I made sure that was in the terms. Silence for a moment. I'm not coming back, Vera said. I have a position here now, and I've built something, and I don't want to undo that. But I needed you to know what you did. The way it came out. It mattered to me. You're the one who submitted the statement, Evelyn said. Took something. It took less than it would have 3 years ago, Vera said. That's the difference, I think. Knowing someone was going to actually read it. Evelyn looked at the window. Outside, Dunmore's late evening light was doing the specific thing it did in autumn, dropping the temperature of the color without reducing the amount of it, turning the street below into something that looked like a photograph of itself. I'm sorry it took this long, Evelyn said. Don't be sorry, Vera said. Just keep doing what you're doing. They talked for 11 more minutes about inconsequential things, Vera's new unit, the difference between East Coast and Midwest hospital cultures, a medication protocol they'd both dealt with that had since been revised nationally. Conversation of two nurses who had both been through something and were now, carefully and without ceremony, finding their way to the other side of it. When they hung up, Evelyn sat for a while. She thought about being 26 in a broken building, keeping a wounded man alive with pressure and focus, and the refusal to stop. She thought about the years between that moment and this one, the reports filed, the meetings sat through, the disciplinary reviews endured, the cardboard box carried through a hospital lobby while 3 nurses at the reception desk watched. She thought about Daniel Rourke, whose heart had found its rhythm again in Bay 5 because a younger nurse has noticed a trend and decided it was worth mentioning. Thought about Priya, who had been afraid of her own instincts and was no longer, or was less afraid, which was the only version of not afraid that actually existed in the long run. She thought about what it cost to keep showing up to a place that kept telling you that what you noticed wasn't worth listening to. She thought about the specific kind of strength required not to perform confidence, but to actually maintain it, to know what you know, to keep knowing it, to keep saying it, when every institutional mechanism around you is designed to make the cost of saying it higher than the reward. She had paid that cost for 9 years. She was going to make sure the nurses who came after her didn't have to pay it the same way. Her first act as ICU nursing director was not dramatic. She updated the patient assessment protocol to require a dual nurse review for all post-surgical patients within the first 24 hours of admission, a change that added approximately 8 minutes per patient per shift and would cost the department in time what it would save in outcomes, a math that previous administrations had consistently run backward. Her second act was to schedule a floor meeting, not a mandatory all-staff assembly, a regular meeting with coffee in the break room on a Tuesday morning at 7:30, when the overnight shift was completing handoff and the day shift was coming on, the natural overlap point when both groups were briefly in the same building. She invited everyone. She told them it would take 30 minutes. She said she had 2 things to tell them, and then she wanted to hear from them. And she meant that in the specific and literal sense, not in the sense of an administrator performing openness. 17 people came. The break room held 12 comfortably. Several people stood in the doorway. She told them about the independent reporting channel. She explained exactly how it worked, the committee structure, the anonymity option, the documentation guarantee, what happened to a report when it was filed, and who had access to it, and what the mechanism was for follow-up. She did not editorialize. She gave them the information. Then she told them about the second opinion protection policy. She explained the same way, specific, practical, no editorializing. Then she said, "What else do you need to know?" The room was quiet for a moment. Dara Hollis, who was standing against the back wall, said, "What happens if a charge nurse discourages someone from using the reporting channel? That discouragement is itself a reportable event under the new protocol," Evelyn said. "And it comes to me directly. And if it's the director doing the discouraging, "Someone in the doorway," said a voice she didn't immediately identify, slightly wary. The question of someone who had been in institutions long enough to know that the person enforcing the rules could also be the problem. "Then you go to the Oversight Committee, which reports to the state authority. And you name me specifically," Evelyn said. "The channel was designed to work even if I'm the one it needs to work against." Point. The person in the doorway didn't respond. Quality of the silence in the room shifted. Something released in it. Some held breath let go. Priya, who was sitting in the corner with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, said quietly, "Why didn't the old reporting system have that?" It was not a rhetorical question. She genuinely wanted to know. "Because the old system was designed to manage reports, not act on them," Evelyn said. "There's a difference. One is about making the institution comfortable. The other is about making patients safe." Priya looked at her coffee. "Are we going to actually be different?" she asked. "Or is this the part where everything looks like it's changing, and then 6 months from now it's the same?" The room waited. Evelyn looked at Priya, at Dara, at Jonah, who was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, watching her the way he always watched things. The careful attention of a man who had learned to measure the distance between what people said and what they did. "I don't know," Evelyn said. A few people shifted. "I don't know," she said again. Because honest answer is that institutions don't change because the right person is in the right room. They change when enough people inside them refuse to participate in the version that doesn't work. And I can build you a better reporting channel, and I can write a better protocol, and I can sit in every board meeting and push for every structural change I have in writing. But if the 16 of you in this room go back to waiting for someone else to speak first, if you go back to the version of this job where noticing something dangerous is a problem you carry alone, then what I built is a structure with nobody inside it." The room was very still. "So I genuinely don't know," she said. "It depends on you as much as it depends on me. Probably more." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Jonah uncrossed his arms and said, "That's a terrible inspirational speech." Laughter, unexpected, moved through the room, genuine and a little startled, the kind that comes when something true lands sideways. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm working on it." The meeting ended at 8:04. People went back to the floor. Bernard, the patient in room 11, whose chart note she had written 8 minutes before her key card was deactivated, was discharged on a Thursday morning 4 weeks after the procedure that had caught his pneumothorax. He stopped at the nursing station on his way out. He had a coat on and a small bag, and the slightly uncertain bearing of a man who had been in a hospital long enough that the outside world felt like a hypothesis. His daughter was with him, a woman in her 40s who had been in to visit every other day. He looked at Evelyn. "They told me," he said, "that you left a note in my chart before you left." "Yes," she said. "They told me that if nobody had read it." He stopped. "My daughter said I should find you and say something." "You don't have to," Evelyn said. "I know." He looked at her, not with the excessive gratitude that sometimes made her uncomfortable, the version that turned a medical decision into a sentimental occasion. He looked at her, the way a man looked at someone who had simply done something real. "I just wanted you to know that I know." It was the same sentence the president had used. She thought about that for a moment. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Follow up with your cardiologist in 2 weeks. Don't skip it because you feel fine." "I won't," he said. His daughter put a hand on his arm, and they walked toward the elevator. Evelyn watched them go, and then turned back to the board. She thought, sometimes, about who she had been before the cardboard box, the nurse, who had filed reports with decreasing expectation that anyone would act on them, who had stayed late and adjusted charts and flagged complications and come home exhausted to an apartment that felt like a place between shifts rather than a place she lived. She had not been defeated then, but she had been in a slow erosion, the kind that you don't feel as it's happening because the pace is too gradual, and you only recognize it when something stops the process and you can look back and see the distance between where you started and where you ended up. What had stopped it was not the president's phone call. It was not the federal assessment, or the board's 3-page document, or the resignation of 2 administrators. Those things had mattered. But they had mattered because they confirmed what she had already refused to stop believing, that what she had seen was real, that her read of it had been correct, and that the people who had told her she was difficult and insubordinate and a problem had been wrong. She had known they were wrong. She had kept knowing it, even when the cost of knowing it was a cardboard box and a key card that no longer worked. That was the thing she could not teach Priya in a break room meeting, or write into a policy document, or guarantee through an oversight committee. The ability to carry what you know when the institution around you insists you're wrong, to sit with the discomfort of being right in a place that's punishing you for it and still not put it down. That was not something you could give someone. It was something each person had to find in themselves, and the only help you could offer was making sure the place they worked stopped making it so expensive. She was trying to do that. She was not always succeeding. Staffing model review had already hit a budget committee complication that she was going to spend the next 2 weeks untangling. The overnight coverage gaps were better but not solved. Gentry's restricted privileges had created a coverage shortage in the cardiac unit that she had not fully anticipated and was now improvising around. The work was messy and incremental, and the institution was large, and its habits were old, and she was one person with a new title, and a signed agreement, and a floor that was watching to see if she meant it. She meant it. That was the only version of this she had ever known how to be. On a Friday evening, 6 weeks after she had walked back through Harlow General's automatic doors carrying nothing but what she already had, Evelyn sat in the nursing station at the end of a long shift and finished the last patient note of the day. The ICU was quiet in the particular way of an 8 p.m. handoff, the day's urgencies resolved or transferred, the overnight team settling in, monitors steady, the building doing the specific thing that buildings that heal people do at night, which is hold very still and let the work continue in the dark. Priya came to drop off the last round summary before she left. She said it's on the counter, then paused. Mrs. Whitmore's follow-up called in, she said. She's doing well. Pressure's been stable 2 weeks running. Good, Evelyn said. She asked if the thorough nurse was still here. Evelyn looked up. I told her yes, Priya said. She picked up her bag. See you Monday, she left. Jonah was already gone. The overnight charge nurse, a man named Paolo, who had been at Harlow General 11 years, and who had started filing his first safety report 3 days after the new reporting channel went live, was making his first rounds of the shift with the clipboard in one hand and the channel's direct report card in his breast pocket. Evelyn looked at the patient board. 8 patients, all of them with names, histories, families, bodies that were working through something hard, all of them in the right place, if they needed to be in a hospital, which was a thing that was easy to forget, that a hospital was supposed to be the right place, that its purpose was not administrative continuity or departmental harmony or the comfort of its leadership, but the specific and unglamorous business of keeping people alive and moving them toward better. She had spent 9 years believing that. She had been fired for it. She had come back and built a structure around it, picked up her bag. She turned off the nursing station light. She walked through the ICU past the bays, past the monitoring station, past the supply corridor, where she had stood with a phone in her hand and felt the particular cold clarity of knowing something was very wrong and having a window in which to act, and she went through the double doors and down the corridor to the elevator. The lobby was quiet when she crossed it, the same lobby where she had walked in 6 weeks ago and felt the room go still. Now it was just a lobby, people coming and going, a security guard at the desk, the ambient sound of a building at the end of a workday. Pushed through the exterior doors. The air outside was cold. Dunmore in November had a specific kind of cold that went straight through whatever you were wearing and reminded you that you were a creature who existed in a body, that the body had needs, that warmth was not a given. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not gathering herself, not marking anything, just being outside after a long day, the same as anyone else. Then she walked to her car. She was back on the floor at 7 the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, not because she needed to prove anything, not because the fight required her constant presence to sustain it, but because the patients in the ICU were real people, and the nurses working alongside her were real people, and the work of making that floor what it was supposed to be was real work, and she was the person who had decided to do it. Cardboard box was in her office now, on a shelf. Coffee mug, the photograph, the faded military patch. She had not arranged them deliberately. She had simply put them down when she moved into the office, and not move them since, and they sat there the way things sit when they have found their place. She did not need them to remember. She had not forgotten a single thing. She did not intend to.